الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So tonight we are going to have a discussion around the concept, let's call it an introduction to the concepts of Al-Halal wal-Haram fil Islam. An introduction to the concept of the lawful and the prohibited in Islam. So I kind of wanted to talk about these two terms and what they mean and how do we recognize this from that and how do we interact with these concepts and with the practical examples of Al-Halal wal-Haram. So let's start first and foremost with the meanings of the terms. The meanings of the terms Al-Halal wal-Haram. The word Al-Halal, which we typically translate as lawful, permitted, legal, etc., it actually encompasses three categories of things. Three categories of things. The first one being Al-Mubah, something which is permitted. The second one being something which is wajib, it is required or obligatory. And the third one being something which is mandub or mustahab, something which is recommended or encouraged. All three of these categories fall under what we generally call halal, lawful, permitted, prescribed, legislated, legal. So for example, the first one, al-mubah, the scholars of Islam, they define it as ما لا يثاب فاعله على فعله ولا يعاقب تاركه على تركه. They define it as that thing or that action or that deed that if a person does it, they're not going to get rewarded for it. And if they abandon it, they're not going to be punished. It's just what? It's permissible. Like what? Like wearing a garment made of cotton. Like sitting in the shade on a hot day. Like drinking a glass of cold water. These are what? Permitted. You won't get a reward if you do it. You won't be sinful if you don't do it. Just what? Permissible. That's one of the things that's included under what we call halal. But the second one we said was wajib. The scholars of Islam, they define al-wujub or al-wajib as ma yuthabu alayhi fa'iluhu imtithalan wa yu'aqab ala tarkihi. It is the thing that if you do it, and you do it with the reward in mind, your intention, I'm doing this because Allah wants me to do it and I want Allah's reward from doing it. If you do it with that intention, you'll get a reward. And if you don't do it, you will warrant punishment. You may or may not be punished, but you will warrant punishment. That's also included under the meaning of what? Al-halal. So if somebody said to you, is prayer halal? You'd say what? Yes. Wouldn't you? Mumtaz. طيب. The last thing that's included under al-halal is al-mandub wal-mustahab. And the scholars of Islam, they define al-mandub wal-mustahab, the thing which is recommended or encouraged. They say, ما يثاب فاعله ما يثاب على فعله امتثالا فاعله ولا يعاقب على تركه تاركه. They say it is that thing that if you do it with the intention of getting a reward, you'll get rewarded. But if you don't do it, you won't be punished. You have the option not to do it, but if you do it, you'll get a reward for it. Like, for example, giving voluntary charity, praying the sunnah prayers, fasting Mondays and Thursdays. These are all examples of things that if you do it, you'll get a reward. If you don't do it, you won't be sinful. And you won't warrant a punishment. Somebody says to you, is fasting Mondays and Thursdays halal? What would you say? You'd say yes. You guys see that? So all three of those are included in the meaning of halal. Al-mubah, something just permissible, like drinking cold water. Al-wajib, like praying the obligatory prayers, giving zakat, fasting Ramadan. And al-mustahab or al-mandub, like fasting Mondays and Thursdays. But on the other side of the equation, other side of the coin, if you will, is al-haram. We can translate it as illegal, forbidden, prohibited. And this, the scholars of Islam, they define it as ما يعاقب على فعله فاعله ويثاب على تركه امتثالا تاركه. They say that the haram is that which if a person does it, he'll warrant punishment. But if he leaves it intentionally, seeking Allah's reward for leaving it, he'll actually warrant a reward. He'll deserve to be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like what? Like drinking alcohol. If a person drinks it, he'll warrant punishment. But if he intentionally doesn't drink it, he intentionally avoids it, he'll actually be rewarded for that. And if for example, also stealing, lying, backbiting, these are all examples of things that if a person does not do them, they'll be rewarded for that. As long as they don't do it intentionally. It's not like, for example, it's not available and they don't do it. But they intentionally avoid it, they'll get a reward for that. So these are the concepts, these are the meanings of the two terms, al-halal wal-haram. And what is meant by the two terms, al-halal wal-haram. Pay attention because I'll quiz you later, inshallah. طيب. Why is this subject important? Why is it important? Why is it worth talking about? Why do you guys think it's worth talking about? I'll ask you. I'll defer to you. Why do you think we should talk about the concept of halal and haram in Islam, and why is it important, worthy of talking about, etc.?
So we can know what is halal and we do it. The intention to seek Allah's reward. And we can know what is prohibited, so we can stay away from it.
Okay, and why is that important? Why is knowing the halal and the haram important? So
we can know it and implement it.
Ahsan, to comply. Okay. So basically, why were we created?
To worship Allah alone.
MashaAllah. To worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. He created us to worship and submit to Him. Sah? Worship and submit to Him through acts of what? Acts of what?
Deeds.
Okay. Deeds of what? Starts with an O, ends with an E. Obey. Obedience. So basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to worship Him and submit to His will, surrender to His will, through acts of what? Obedience. Everybody agree with that? So basically, that necessitates that we know what is what? Permitted. I said right and wrong. We know what's permitted, so we do the permitted things. We know what's prohibited, so we avoid the prohibited things. Right? So we can do what? Comply, fulfill our purpose, and earn Allah's what? His pleasure. His reward, His pleasure, His paradise. You guys see that? How can we do that if we don't know halal and haram? We don't know right and wrong. You guys see that? It's so important. It's critically important for the Muslim to concern themselves with it. And so that tells us, if we understand this, that tells us how wrong it is for some Muslims to basically delegitimize the discussion of halal and haram. To basically say, we shouldn't talk about this. We shouldn't talk about it. We should just talk about fada'il al-a'mal, the virtues of deeds. But we shouldn't talk about halal and haram. We shouldn't say that people are doing things that are wrong. People are doing something wrong, we just what? We avert our eyes. We don't say anything. We don't criticize. They say, criticize, nobody likes that word. We don't criticize anyone. We don't talk about halal and haram. If we don't talk about halal and haram, if we delegitimize the discussion, how can we do the halal and avoid the haram? How can we do that? So, one of the things that's important for us as we have this discussion, brothers and sisters, it's important for us to embrace the legitimacy of the concept that there's something in Islam called halal and there's something in Islam called haram. We have to embrace that. Embrace that concept of what? Of legitimacy. And this is something that if you open the Quran and you read the Sunnah, you can't escape. You can't escape it. How can you delegitimize the concept of halal and haram when what? The Quran and Sunnah are full of what? Al-halal and haram. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. Allah has legalized, has permitted trade, commerce, and has prohibited, has forbidden interest. He says, for example, حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةِ. Allah has prohibited for you the eating of what? Of carrion, of dead animals, the carcasses of dead animals. أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ لَيْلَةَ الصِّيَامِ الرَّفَثُ إِلَى نِسَائِكُمْ. Legalized for you, lawful for you on the night of the fast is going unto your wives. أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَحْرِ. Lawful for you is the game, the marine game, or what? Or fishing. You guys see that? You almost don't turn a page in the Quran except what? أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ. The Quran is full of it. Similarly, the Sunnah. We see in the Sunnah the same thing. And one of the most famous ahadith that point to this and make it clear to us that this is a concept that is embedded in our religion is the famous hadith of Nu'man ibn Bashir. Collected by Bukhari Muslim, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-halalu inna al-halala bayin, wa inna al-harama bayin, wa baynahuma umurun mushtabihat. La ya'lamuhunna kathirun min al-nas. Faman ittaqa al-shubuhat istabra'a li dinihi wa irdihi. ومن وقع في الشبهات وقع في الحرام. كالراعي يرعى حول الحمى يوشك أن يرتع فيه. ألا وإن لكل ملك حمى. ألا وإن حمى الله محارمه. ألا في الجسد مضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله. وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب. والله من أعظم الأحاديث. He said in this hadith what means. He said, indeed, the lawful is clear, and the unlawful or the illegal is clear. And between the two of them, there are some matters which are what? Which are gray areas. Gray areas meaning, is it lawful? Is it unlawful? It's not entirely what? Not entirely clear. Then he said, لا يعلمهن كثير من الناس. These gray areas, the ruling of them, many people don't know. فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ. As for he who avoids those gray areas, just doesn't fool with them altogether. I'm not sure, is it halal or haram? So I do what? I err on the side of caution. إِسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَيَرْضِهِ. Then he has thereby protected his religion and his reputation. وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ وَقَعَ فِي الْحَرَامِ. But he who delves into those gray areas will invariably do something illegal, fall into the haram. Then he gives an example, because he loved to give these examples, which were what? Malmusa. He liked to give these practical examples to help people go off the theoretical plane to what? To the practical plane. To make that knowledge accessible, help them understand what he intended. He said, Karra'i yar'a hawla al-hima. Like a person who has sheep. Very common for them to what? To have sheep and graze sheep. Grazes his sheep near a forbidden territory. A territory that belongs to what? Someone with authority and with power who will do what? Who will penalize you if you enter his area. Yushik and yartafi. You know how sheep are. You know how sheep are. They're going to get away from you. So if you let them graze on the line, pretty soon they'll what? They'll graze across the line. Ala wa inni li kulli malikin hima. Certainly every king has a what? Has a forbidden territory. An area that they don't want anyone to enter without permission. Ala wa inna himallahi maharimu. Indeed, the prohibited territory of Allah are the things that he has what? Prohibited. Think about what the Prophet is saying. When it comes to the prohibited things, he doesn't want you to be what? Close to the line. He wants you to stay away from the line. Then he said, ألا وإن في الجسد مضغة إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله. He said, certainly there is in the body a lump of flesh. If it is pure and sound and upright, the whole body, everything the person does and says will be upright. And if it is foul and corrupt, everything he says and does will be foul and corrupt. And certainly it is what? It is the heart. I want to reflect with you on the meaning, on some of the things we can take away from this hadith, because it's such a great hadith and it's related to our topic. So we'll digress a little bit and then come back. And then I have a few more words and then I'll open the floor for discussion. So the first thing that we were talking about was the legitimacy of the concept of what? Al-halal al-haram. And what does the Prophet say? The first thing out of his mouth is what? Inna al-halal bayin wal-haram bayin. What does he say? There's something called, Muslim, there's something called what? Halal and haram. Don't shy away from it. Don't be afraid of it. Don't reject it. Embrace it. It's what? It's part of the deen. This is what the Prophet is saying. Then he says, each of these categories, their contents are generally clearly distinguishable. How? Either because we have an explicit text. Allah and His Messenger told us so. So for example, the Prophet said in the one hadith, he said, ألا وإن من كان قبلكم كانوا يتخذون قبور أنبيائهم وصالحيهم مساجدا ألا فلا تتخذوا القبور مساجد فإني أنهاكم عن ذلك. He said, indeed, the people before you, they used to take the graves of their prophets and their righteous people as masajid, as a place for prayer, a place of worship. They would go there and offer acts of worship. And that led them ultimately to do what? To worship the people in those spaces. So the Prophet said, we have to learn from one, from their errors. He said, Allah wa inni, he said, Allah, la tattakhidu al-qubur masajid. He said, do not take the graves as places of worship. We don't pray there. We don't read Quran there. We don't do these things. Then he said, فَإِنِّي أَنْهَاكُمْ عَنْ ذَلِكَ. He said, indeed, I prohibit you from that. Explicit. He's telling you what? This is prohibited. Explicit text. Don't do that. I'm prohibiting you from doing that. So this is how we know something is haram, because what? Allah and His Messenger have been very what? Emphatic. Type another way we know something is haram, clearly, is because there's unanimous agreement, unanimous consensus. So for example, An-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala in Riyadh al-Salihin, he said, أجمع العلماء على أن التوبة واجبة من كل ذنب. He said the scholars of Islam are unanimously agreed that repentance is required from every sin. He said what? Unanimously agreed that what? Repentance is required. Repentance is what? Halal or haram? Halal, right? Mumtaz. But then the Prophet, he says there's some gray areas. بينهما أمور مشتبهات. There's some gray areas. Why are there gray areas? Because sometimes what happens is that we look at the teachings of Islam and those teachings give us dual indications. They send what? Contradictory messages sometimes. And we have to now navigate that, and it leads what? It leads us to be somewhat confused about what's the ruling. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, one day he was in a majlis with some of his companions. فَجَاءَهُ رَجُلٌ فَسَأَلَهُ أو استأذنه في التقبيل وهو صائم. He asked the Prophet, is it okay if I kiss my wife while I'm fasting? فأذن له. So the Prophet said, yes, absolutely. ثم جاء آخر. Then another man came. فاستأذنه في التقبيل فلم يأذن له. So in this case, another man came. And he asked the Prophet the same exact question. And the Prophet said, no, you can't do that. So now if you look at the hadith on the surface of it, you say, is it halal or haram? Because the hadith itself gives you what? Dual indications, doesn't it? He permitted the first one, you say it must be okay. He prohibited the second one, you say, maybe it's not okay. You guys see that? Like, sometimes there are two texts which are apparently, underscore the word apparently, contradictory. Meaning that the Prophet said something here, and it seems to contradict what he said here. I said apparently, why? Because the Quran and Hadith don't contradict each other. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبِّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. He said, do they not contemplate the Quran? If it had been from other than Allah, they would have found it in much what? Contradiction. So Allah is telling us that if it comes from Him and the Sunnah comes from Him, it can't have contradictions in it. So sometimes there may be an apparent contradiction, which means what? The problem is not in the text, the problem is what? The way we've understood it. Like, that being said, I'll give you an example. In the hadith of Talq ibn Ali radiyallahu anhu, he said that a man came to the Prophet and he said, Ya Rasulullah, massastu dhakari, hal atawadda? فقال صلى الله عليه وسلم لا إنما هو بضعة منك. A man came to the Prophet and he said, O Messenger of Allah, I touched my private part. Shall I make wudu? The Prophet said, no. It's just what? A part of you. It's like touching what? Your elbow. طيب. In the hadith of Busra bin Safwan, the Prophet said, من مس ذكره فليتوضأ. He said, whoever touches his private part must what? Must make wudu. You guys see that? In one, he said, it's just, إِنَّمَا هُوَ بِضْعَةٌ مِنْكَ. It's just what? A part of you. Another one, he said, you have to make wudu. There's what? We got to reconcile now. And people have different opinions based upon this. The madhahib have different opinions based upon what? Which of the two hadith they consider to be what? The right hadith or the right opinion. And then sometimes what happens is that the gray area comes from the fact that the scholars have what? Have differed. The scholars themselves have differed. They've drawn different conclusions. And based upon those different conclusions, some people say this and some people say what? They say that. That creates what? A gray area. Is it halal? Is it haram? Then the Prophet said, لا يعلمهن كثير من الناس. He said, many people have no knowledge and are unable to distinguish the halal from the haram when it comes to these gray areas. They don't know. They don't know. This is the case for what? For many people. They are uncertain. I'm not really sure. And then the Prophet said or gave us advice on how we should conduct ourselves in those cases. He said, فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ اسْتَبْرَأَ لِدِينِهِ وَيَرْضِهِ. Whoever avoids these gray areas, just errs on the side of caution, that person will protect what? His religion and his reputation. Tells you two things. One, what the Prophet wants us to do when we don't know for sure if something is right or wrong, he wants us to do what? Err on the side of caution. As he said in the other hadith, دَعْ مَا يَرِيبُكَ إِلَى مَا لَا يَرِيبُكَ. Leave what is doubtful for that which is certain. So let's say, for example, in this case, let's go back to the hadith of Talq and the hadith of Busra. In one hadith, the Prophet is saying, if you touch yourself, you will break your wudu. Which means that if you touched yourself and then you went to pray and you didn't make wudu, would your prayer be accepted? In the other hadith, he's saying, إِنَّمَا هُوَ بِضْعَةٌ مِنْكَ. It doesn't what? It doesn't break your wudu and you're fine. So here you have what? Doubt. In a case like this, where would the caution be? Ahsan, to make wudu. You guys see that? Basically, the Prophet is saying, if you're not certain, is it this or this? Err on the side of caution. Do the most cautious thing. You guys see that? That's how we're supposed to operate. And he says the one who does this will safeguard his what? His religion, his reputation, which means we're supposed to care about those two things. The Prophet is saying, care enough about your reputation, what people will say, if I do this or if I do that, and care enough about your religion to do what? To err on the side of caution. A Muslim should care. A Muslim should not throw caution to the wind. This could poke a hole in my religion. This could cause people to look at me what? Differently. I don't care. I don't care what people think. No, we should care. Otherwise, he wouldn't have what? He wouldn't have mentioned it. Then he said, وَمَنْ وَقَعَ فِي الشُّبُهَاتِ وَقَعَ فِي الْحَرَامِ. And whoever delves into these gray areas will ultimately delve into the haram. He will commit the haram. What does that mean? Let's say that there are 20 issues that this person is interacting with, dealing with, that are gray areas. And he does what? He throws caution to the wind and what? And does the thing that's not the cautious thing. The Prophet is saying at some point he's going to err, he's going to be wrong and do the thing which is haram. You guys see that? Invariably, some of those things that he does, which are what? Gray areas, are going to be what? Haram. He's going to fall into the haram. Then the last thing he did, he closes the hadith, and you might say, okay, it seems like these are like two separate hadith. They don't seem to go together, but they do go together. He said all of this about al-halal, wal-haram, and avoiding shubuhat and gray areas between them, and then he said, أَلَا فِي الْجَسَدِ مُضْغَةٌ. Certainly in the body there is a lump of flesh. If it is pure and sound and upright, the whole body will be upright. And if it is foul and corrupt, the whole body will be corrupt. It is the heart. Tell me the connection. Tell me what the Prophet is saying.
If you're good, you're going to go towards good.
What is, okay, elaborate. Okay, stay away from the gray areas, but how do you connect that with this expression that he said? How does that translate to stay away from the gray areas?
You'll feel it.
Okay, so the Prophet starts out the hadith, and his focus is what? There's something called halal, there's something called haram, and the halal and haram, these two categories are clear, and everything that falls in these categories is generally clear. But there are some gray areas. Many people don't know what? The halal from the haram and those gray areas. You, O Muslim, should err on the side of caution and avoid the gray areas, and if you do that, you'll protect your religion and your reputation. Just like a ra'i, a shepherd, shepherding his sheep, grazing his sheep, close to what? Close to the line of prohibited territory. Pretty soon they're going to be what? Grazing the prohibited territory. Then he says, certainly in the body there's a lump of flesh. If it is sound, pure, and upright, the whole body will be what? Upright. If it is foul and corrupt, the whole body will be corrupt. It's the heart. What's the connection? What's the connection between all of that and then this last statement about the heart? Tafadali.
Heart is the base and everything in you. So if you have a good heart, it will tell you, you know, this is halal, this is haram. So if the heart is salim, the heart is good. That's what I thought was going to say, is that the unbelief. Because the heart knows, you know, if you're doing something kind of, suspicious, suspicious, you still do it. But if you listen to your heart, you know that this is haram, this is halal, that you are doing it. So the heart knows. That's why he ends it with that.
Okay.
The healthy heart, you know the right and wrong.
Okay, you know the right and wrong. And then you do the wrong. So what is that? Tafadal, I mean, I'm going to hear from you. I don't want to say until I hear from everybody. Tafadal.
Okay, well, I take it as you're going to feel, you're asking law for guidance. For example, the touching yourself issue. Now, when you're putting your clothes on, you may touch yourself. Putting your clothes on. Versus if you're playing with yourself. You'll know. You should be able to feel like what was deliberate and what was unintentional.
Okay.
So you have like a barometer. Your heart is kind of like your barometer for right and wrong. If it feels bad, it's bad. If it feels good, you're good.
Okay. Anybody else? Tafadal, Yunus,
If to have a sound heart, if you avoid the gray areas, you're going to have a sound heart.
Okay. If you avoid the gray areas, that tells you something about what?
Or your heart.
Watson, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. My point was to have a sound heart, you have to avoid the gray areas.
But flip it around on the other side. If you avoid the gray areas, it tells you what?
That you have a sound heart.
It tells you something about your heart. Tayyib, he said, tafadal Shaykh. I'm coming to you. You have peace in your heart and you have no doubt. Mumtaz. Tafadali.
Does it have something to do with the intentions of the heart? Because if I can do two acts, right? And the first act that I do, okay, say we're just touching yourself. My intention is to touch myself, to do whatever I need to do to cleanse myself and things like that. But then if I touch myself with the intention of doing something improper or inappropriate, so that's the gray area. I'm touching myself either way, but my intention is to do something wrong.
I'm going to respond to that. I rob from the rich and give to the poor. And my intention is to help the poor people. Does that make what I'm doing right?
No.
Mumtaz.
No, but I'm saying if
I got what you're saying, but the prophet here is not talking about what? Not talking about intention. He's talking about what? Halal and haram. Stealing is haram, regardless of your intention. Awlillah? Is that not so? Mumtaz. Tafadali. Yes. I'm coming to you, Muhammad.
So to help yourself to avoid shubuhat is by keeping a sound heart. So once your heart is full of the love of Allah, of Iman, that will help you know the shubuhat and avoid it. It's going to make it easy on you when you have a sound heart. It will be easy on you to know shubuhat and to avoid it.
But that's not wrong. That's not wrong. That is not wrong. Tafadal Muhammad and then Abdul-Razak.
This is why I think.
Of course, is what you think, because you're saying it. Tafadal Shaykh.
Like, when Allah says, like, what if the trouble, for instance, what the brothers in.
Okay.
Well, I was giving an example, and I feel like the Prophet is doing the same thing for this example, because like when he tells us about the heart, he wants us to stay away so far away from it, in order for us to have a purified heart. This is just what I think.
We know what you think because you said it.
But I'm saying I could be wrong.
MashaAllah. Now, may Allah bless you, Muhammad. I'm just teasing you, brother. Tafadhal, Abdul Razak. Yes.
When I came to the Prophet and asked, how do I know if I'm doing something wrong? And he said, your heart will tell you.
Okay.
So if your heart is good, if you Allah, your heart will be pure enough to be able to tell you you're doing something wrong, or doing something good. So,
okay.
Can I go off something?
Go ahead. Tafadhal.
Like what he said is that if you are, let's say, staying away from most gray areas.
Okay.
I'm saying most, not all.
All right.
And you're staying on the side of haram all the time.
MashaAllah.
You're just trying to stay away from haram all the time. That's what you're building yourself up to do. Over and over and over. Your body, your heart, everything is always on the side.
Okay. All right.
And as you get to that point, then the next things that you do, because you've always been following that line, is going to stay on that.
Jimmy.
So you're not going to go towards the bad because you've already started and continued going towards the good.
Jimmy. All right. Anybody else? Tafadhal, Dr. Ismail. Yes.
Your heart is the source of your iman.
Okay.
So if you have the right iman, that reflects on your good heart. If your iman is correct, your heart is correct.
Sir? Okay. Let me ask you guys a question. A lot of people said if you have a good heart, the good heart will help you gauge, determine, differentiate, distinguish between halal and haram. A lot of people said that. And they use as a proof the hadith, istafti qalbak. Right? Seek the verdict of your heart. Ask your heart. I want to ask you guys a question. Is it possible for a person and yaghtar to be deceived? Deceived by his own piety. And for the shaitan to use that to make him think, I'm so pious, astafti qalbi, I'm going to seek the verdict of my heart. My heart says it's okay. I go with it. Is that possible? Tayyib, mumtaz. Exactly. So now, let's come back to what the Prophet said. He was talking about the gray areas, right? Then he closed the hadith and he said, Ala fil jasadi mudghah. Certainly there is in the body a lump of flesh. إِذَا صَلَحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسْدُ كُلُّهُ. If it is upright and sound and good, then what? The actions. When he said, صَلَحَ الْجَسْدُ كُلُّهُ, the body will be sound, all of it, he meant what? The actions, the things that you do, your behavior. It will be right. It will be what? Away from what? The haram. In accordance with what? The halal. Tayyib. We talked a lot about the qalb as-salim, the pure heart, the clean heart, the sound heart. Does it have characteristics? Does it have characteristics? Does it have features by which it can be recognized? But what's one feature by which it can be recognized that the Prophet alluded to in the hadith? The qalb as-salim, al-qalb as-salim, it has features, qualities, alamat, right? Sifat. You guys agree with that? Mumtaz. What is one of the features of that pure heart that the Prophet alluded to in the hadith? Huh? Mumtaz. Mumtaz. So, if you want to avoid, you seek to avoid, you seek to stay away from the gray areas, know that what? Your heart is pure. This is a sign that your heart is pure. But if you have the tendency to do what? To skirt the line. To skirt the line between halal and haram. That's an indication that what? Your heart is impure. Because why? If your heart was pure, your actions would be pure. Your desires would be pure. And what's the hadith say? The hadith attributed to the Prophet, he said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. None of you truly believes until what? Until his desires, his wants, the things that he inclines toward are consistent with what I brought. Y'all see that? And so this is what the Prophet is saying. That when you are always skirting that line, always grazing your sheep, close to what? The forbidden territory. It's an indication of what? Of what's going on inside. You can't say, despite this inclination to haram, despite that, my heart is pure. No, know that if you incline toward haram, your heart is not what? Is not pure. There's a problem. Does it mean your heart is totally corrupt? No, but what it means is that there is a talazum bain al-zahir wal-batin. Al-zahir wal-batin mutalaziman la yanfakkan. That basically what's inside and outside are what? They are inseparably linked. If you're 80% good on the outside, you're what? 80% good on the inside. And if you're 20% good on the outside, then you're what? And you can't be like the people who say, you don't know what's in my heart. My heart is pure. Even though what? They're doing all the wrong things. You guys see that? Mumtaz. That's what the Prophet is saying. Alhamdulillah. And we digress quite a bit, and I want to leave time for you guys. So let's just quickly talk about a couple of things and then we'll close. So one, what should be the stance? Now that we know that this concept is a real concept, a fundamental part of our religion, what should be the stance of the Muslim? What should be the stance of the Muslim toward al-halal and haram? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I'll give you two verses. One of them is from Surah Al-Ahzab. The 33rd chapter, verse number 36, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا إِن يَكُنْ لَهُمُ الْخِيرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ وَمَن يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا. He says it's not befitting for a man or a believing woman, it's not for a believing man or a believing woman once Allah and His Messenger have given their decision in a matter to feel at liberty to contradict what they have decided. To feel that it's their right to do what? To swim upstream, to go the opposite way. Indeed, whosoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger have clearly gone far astray. The second ayah comes to us from Surah Al-Hujurat. It's the very beginning, verses 1 and 2. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله إن الله سميع عليم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. He says, O you who believe, do not put yourselves ahead of Allah and His Messenger. What does that mean, put yourselves ahead of Allah and His Messenger?
Think you know best.
Huh?
To think that you know best.
Okay, it's like a person saying, Allah said, and a person says, well, I think, I feel. You guys see that? So you're putting yourself ahead. Yeah, Allah said that, but I push that to the back, to the periphery, and I do what? I put myself in front of that. But what I think, I feel, in my humble opinion. You guys see that? Then he says, indeed Allah hears and knows all things. He says, and fear Allah, indeed Allah hears and knows all things. And he says, O you who believe, do not raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet, nor interact with him in the same manner that you interact with one another, lest your deeds should be nullified unbeknownst to you. So he says, first of all, don't raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet. How can a believer do that and the Prophet passed away? Huh? Is it denying what he said?
Putting yourself first, ahead of what the...
Okay. Practical example. Give me a practical example.
Simple example, birthdays not allowed, but then everybody says it's just a gathering, it's a birthday, so I'm going to do a birthday, it's not a big deal, but it's not a mountain, just stand aside, don't do it.
Hey.
Stand praise.
Hey.
And say it's just, it's not a big deal, it's a birthday. That's maybe an example.
So the Prophet said, and somebody says, I know the hadith, but I know. The person says, well, the Prophet said, I know, but what are you doing now? You're talking over the Prophet. You guys see that? You're talking over the Prophet. There should be, the Prophet said, there should be no what? I know, but. The Prophet said, Sami'na wa ta'na. We hear and we obey. That's what we should say. Otherwise, we're doing what? We're talking over the Prophet. Then he said, and don't interact with him in the same way you interact with what? With each other. What does that mean? See, I mean, what do you think about electric cars, man? What's your opinion on electric cars? What's your opinion on masking? Do you think masking protects us from diseases, the spread of disease?
Well, it's our attempt to do it.
Do you think they're effective?
Somewhat.
Not
Not 100%.
I don't agree with you. I don't think they're effective at all. And I think, in fact, you're breathing your own air and giving yourself diseases.
How come I ain't falling over?
Right now, he has an opinion, I have an opinion, and my opinion is just as what? As just as worthy of being asserted as his opinion. You guys see that? That's how I feel, even though that opinion is wrong, right? But if it's the Messenger of Allah, I can't consider my opinion what? On the same one? On the same plane. I have just as much as right to say what I think as the Messenger of Allah. No, you don't. Your opinion means nothing if he what? If he offers his opinion. You guys see that? Tafadhali. Wa alaikum salam.
What if it isn't an opinion, but you just try to understand it? And you say, well, my understanding is.
No, it's different. There's a difference between, I'm not sure if it means that, but is that what it really means? There's a difference between that and I know but, as if what? I'm dismissing what the Prophet said. You see that? There's a difference between the two. Yeah, I don't know that. I don't think that's what the Prophet meant by that. I don't have an issue with following the Prophet. I have an issue with what? The way you're interpreting what the Prophet said. No, some people will say, I know what the Prophet said, but as if to say what? It's just impractical. It doesn't make sense. I don't agree with it. That's a problem. Now you're doing what? You're talking over the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You guys see the difference? Mumtaz. All right, let's close out because I got to give you guys some time to talk. So really quickly, how do we know something is, since this is so important, how do we know if something is halal and something is haram? How do we know? Okay, the sources are clear. But when we go to those sources, how do we know that from this source, I'm reading this and it tells me, from this I'm reading, and I know that this is what? This is halal, this is haram. I'm going to give you some quick ones ala ujala without any examples because of time. I want to give you guys some time to talk. Tayyib. First one, let's take a general rule. There's a general rule. When it comes to non-religious things, it's not an act of worship or a wasila. It's not an act of worship or a means to an act of worship. The general rule is what? It's permissible. Al-aslu fil ashya al-hillu wal-ibaha. The general rule when it comes to things that are not related to worship is that they're what? Permitted. Somebody says, can a man wear a yellow shirt?
Yes.
You have to say what? Yes. If you say no, the burden of proof is on who? The one who says no. Because this is not religious. It's not deen, right? The original rule when it comes to non-deen things, non-deen related things, is it's permissible. And the original rule when it comes to what? Religious things is that they're not permissible. Unless what? Unless you have proof that they're permissible. When it comes to the deen, we just can't do whatever we want to do, even if we have no what? No proof for it. And you see this in the Quran and the Sunnah. Allah is saying, basically, this is what? This is mine. This is mine, and no one should legislate or prescribe something deen related except what? except if he has proof from me or from my messenger. Allah says in the Quran, for example, He says, أَمْ لَهُمْ شُرَكَاء شَرَعُوا لَهُم مِنَ الدِّينِ مَا لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ. Do they have partners, rival gods, who legislated for them a religion that Allah has not sanctioned? You guys see that? When it comes to deen, we can't just do whatever we want. We have to have proof for what we do. And the Prophet said in the hadith, مَنْ عَمِلَ عَمَلًا لَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ أَمْرُنَا فَهُوَ رَدٌّ. Whoever does a religious deed that we have not legislated, meaning Allah and His Messenger, it will be what? It will be rejected. You guys see that? So that's the first qaida. The first thing I know is that if it's non-deen, I'm allowed to do it unless what? There's proof to the contrary. If it's deen, I can't do it unless what? Unless there's proof to the contrary. طيب. Suppose Allah in the Quran, He refers to something as what? As halal, as jaiz, as mubah, permissible, permitted, legal, lawful. That makes it what? Lawful. But another thing is if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His Quran or the Prophet in His hadith, they negate al-hurma, or they negate al-ithm, sin, or they negate al-junah, or al-haraj, difficulty, hardship, or any shame or blame. If they negate that, that means it's what? It's permissible. Right? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the right to choose between two things, or His Messenger. So for example, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, أَتَوَضَّعُ مِنْ لَحْمِ الْغَنَمِ or مِنْ أَكْلِ لَحْمِ الْغَنَمِ. He said, should I make wudu after eating the meat of sheep, lamb meat? And the Prophet said, إِنْ شِئْتَ تَتَوَضَّعُ وَإِنْ شِئْتَ لَا تَتَوَضَّعُ. He said, if you want, make wudu. If you don't want, you don't have to make wudu. If He gives you the choice, it means what? It's lawful. You guys see that? طيب ثم بعد ذلك, what if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger refer to something as haram, or ma'siyah, or them, or ithm? If they use that language, it makes it what? Haram. We can't do it. If Allah and His Messenger, they deny the lawfulness of something, right? They say, la yahil. This is not lawful. It's not legal. That makes it what? Haram. But if Allah and His Messenger, they use the usloob of a nahi, la an-nahiya. They say, for example, don't do this. La taqrabu zina. Don't come close to adultery. That makes it what? Absolutely prohibited. Bi ijma' sahaba. And then last but not least, suppose Allah and His Messenger, they blame, they threaten to punish the one who does a certain act. They blame them. They say, hey, the person who does this is bad. The person who does this is not a good Muslim, not a good believer. Or they threaten to punish. The person who does this will what? Will go to hellfire. The person who does this will come on the day of judgment and what? And have long nails that they'll what? They'll scratch their face. Like He talked about the one who begs. He said the person who begs, every time they beg, they do what? They scratch their face. And some people come on the day of judgment with no what? With no skin on their face from what? From constant begging. If Allah blames something, or blames someone for doing something, or promise a punishment for something, it makes it what? Makes it haram. And last but not least, I'll say this, that a form of blaming is if Allah or His Messenger link something or associate something with the shaitan or with the jahiliyyah. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the people who do this are following the footsteps of the shaitan, or they're the brothers of the shayateen. Like for example, وَلَا تُبَذِّرْ تَبْذِيرًا إِنَّ الْمُبَذِّرِينَ كَانُوا إِخْوَانَ الشَّيَاطِينَ. And don't squander wastefully. Those who waste, they are the brothers of the devils. That makes it what? Haram. Because what is Allah doing? He's criticizing the people who what? Who do it. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he mentioned, he said, وَالشَّرِعَةِ لَا تَذَمْ إِلَّا عَلَى تَرْكِ وَاجِبٍ أَوْ فِعْلِ مُحَرَّمٍ. He said, Allah and His Messenger don't criticize anyone or anything except for leaving an obligation or doing something prohibited. And so this is just an introduction. And what I hope to do in the fall, inshallah ta'ala, there's a book that was compiled by Yusuf al-Qaradawi. It's called Al-Halal wal-Haram fil Islam. It's actually a very good book in terms of what? It's like a glossary. He has combined all of the different areas of life and talked about what is lawful and what is prohibited. We may not agree with some of the opinions and conclusions, but the one thing he did was what? He compiled all of this information in one place, and nobody else did that. So what I'm hoping to do is that we're going to have some offerings, some like intensive offerings, like proper academic, scholastic teachings that we're going to do, courses that we're going to give. And one of them we're going to offer is this Halal wal Haram, a study of this book. It will be very useful for all of us. And I mean like studying the way we did in university. This is good. It's good for everyone. But some people want something what? A little bit more intensive. We're going to have this. We're going to have fiqh as-sirah. We're going to have some offerings. And one of them will be this. We're going to study this book, but this was like an introduction to the concept of halal and haram. And we need to embrace this concept. And we need to understand how we should behave and interact with the concept of halal and haram in our deen. That's what we did today. And now I'll give you guys an opportunity if there's any questions, comments, or critiques. Tafaddal, Omar.
Can you please tell us about the qualifications of the person? So, can you please tell us about the qualifications of the person that is able to do ijtihad or able to say halal or haram if it's not paid in
That's a long discussion, but we'll summarize it by saying there are people who are scholars by profession, by training, and those are the people who make ijtihad. The people who don't have that level are one of two people. They're either al-muttabi', the follower, who's able to read the fatwa of the people who make ijtihad, look at their dalil, understand how they came to the conclusion, without what? Having the ability to go through the whole process the way that they do. But they know what the person said, and they know what their evidence is, and they're following what? The evidence. That person, what they call a muttabi', a follower. Then you have the muqallid, the blind follower. I know the opinion, I don't know the evidence. I'm following what? The person on the strength of what? Of their scholastic academic reputation and credentials. So you have three levels of people. Muqallid, blind follower. I don't know what the scholar's evidence is, but I know what his opinion is. And I follow his opinion on the strength of what? His knowledge, his credentials, his cachet as a scholar. Muttabi', I know what the scholar said. I know his evidence. And I'm following what? Following his opinion because his evidence is what? Is sound. It makes sense. And then last but not least, mujtahid. The one who what? Who studies, goes to the different texts and sources, goes through the process of determining what is the strongest of the opinions and comes to a conclusion about the issue. So the people who are on this level, they have specialized skills. Anybody who doesn't have those specialized skills will fall into one of those two lower categories.
So they should be in that level to make a fatwa.
They have to be a mujtahid to make a fatwa, yes.
And nobody can make a fatwa by himself.
No, either they know or they don't know. But I'll say this too. You have a mujtahid in one area. He's qualified to do that, to make ijtihad in what? In a certain mas'ala, for example, a certain issue. And he might not be qualified in another issue. And then you have somebody who's what? Qualified in what? A multitude of issues. That could be the case as well. Sisters, there was a question in the back. Can we give you the mic? Can somebody give her the mic, please?
In an instance of advising from the halal, what is seeds of parent? Is it just a matter of, well, not just, but a matter of just giving proof of evidence?
طيب. What we have to understand. Adhan? Dagiga? Okay. All right, so what we have to understand is that when it comes to the halal and haram, there are some things which are halal and haram and they are not disputed. If they're not disputed, then it's as simple as saying this is what it is and providing the proof. If they're disputed, then a person can advise if they know the issue and they know the proof. The thing we have to be careful from, and people do this all the time, is that they're going to advise a person in a matter in which there's a difference of opinion, the issue is disputed, it's up for debate, and they're going to say, you have to do this. And then the person says, why? And they say, because Sheikh so-and-so said. That is wrong. If you are a muqallid, if you are a blind follower, all you know is that I follow this because so-and-so said. You can't advise someone based upon that. Because al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa-nahy al-munkar, enjoining good and forbidding evil, one of the fundamental requirements for it is knowledge. And a taqleed, blind following, is not knowledge. So, a person might ask you, hey, I noticed that when you pray, you put your hands here. And you might tell them, yeah, I put my hands here because this is what I read from so-and-so. That's fine. But if you see a person putting their hands on their sides, for example, and you say, hey, what are you doing? You can't put your hands on your sides. What's wrong with you? You got to put your hands here. And they say, well, why? That's not what I was taught. And you say, well, you have to do it because Sheikh so-and-so said. That would be wrong. Line aside, akhi. Line aside, akhi. Is that clear? Is that clear?
No. What if we just say ask the Imam?
Huh?
What if we just say ask the Imam?
Would we say what?
What if we just say ask the Imam?
Ask the Imam. I mean, yeah, you could refer someone to someone and say, hey, this is what I read on that.
Well, even the man is like the mansion.
Uh-huh.
Time for Salah.
Mm-hmm.
Close their rights.
Okay.
Because the shaitan.
But you know the evidence now. So you're quoting the evidence, and you're encouraging them to follow the evidence. Then if they start disputing, they say, no, I read something different. Or I heard something different. That's not what I was taught. So now this is what? It's disputed. So now you're not going to what? Push, but you could refer them to somebody you feel who could explain the issue and clarify it, and who's what? On one of those higher levels. If you're on the level of taqleed, there's only so much you can do. And the mistake that we make is that we're on the level of taqleed. 1 second, Ahmed, I know, and I'm going to give it to you. If we're on that level of taqleed, there's only so much we can do. We can tell people what we know, where we know it from, but we can't tell them what? You have to do this, and you have to do it because what? Because so-and-so said. That's not appropriate. That's not appropriate. And the whole discussion, maybe we'll have another discussion separately about the whole discussion of difference of opinion and how to what? How to navigate those. The etiquettes of differing. This is very, very important, especially in a masjid this diverse. It's very, very important for us to understand the etiquettes of differing and how to coexist. The difference between al-masail lati yasugu al-khilafu fiha wal-masail lati la yasugu al-khilafu fiha, the issues in which difference of opinion are permitted and the issues in which difference of opinion are not permitted. Understanding all those and navigating those is very, very important. We'll have a discussion, inshallah ta'ala, about that later on. But just know in general is that we have to practice a little tolerance. Naveed, I'll tell you what, let's do the adhan, and then we'll take khams daqaiq. We'll do 5 minutes of exchange, and then we'll pray. Who's going to give the adhan? Omar. Tfadal. Go ahead, Omar. Jazakallah khair.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Allahu Akbar. Allah.
Allahu Akbar,
Allahu Akbar.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
أشهد أن لا إله
أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله.
أشهد أن محمد رسول الله.
حي على الصلاة.
لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله.
حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح.
لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله.
حي على الفلاح.
لا حول.
الله أكبر. الله أكبر.
الله أكبر. الله.
لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة. آتي محمد وسيم So, with your permission, we're going to do about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to pray. And our prayer will be relatively short, inshallah ta'ala. Everybody okay with that? Yep. Tafadhal, Dr. Nabi. Walaikum salam.
Now, my question is about the rulings, dietary restrictions.
Hey.
The Quran is pretty clear about a few things: blood, dead animals,
Hey.
pork, things that have been slaughtered in another name other than Allah. But when we look at some of the schools of thought, some of the sects, they're so restrictive that the fish doesn't have scales, or
Hey.
it will be shrimp, or this or that, or if a bird has a curved beak. So where do these things come from?
Hey.
And are they legitimate? I mean, how do we determine for foods, different animals, which ones are halal and permissible, and
Hey.
what are the authentic sources that we go to?
Ahsan. Okay. So the first thing we start with is the principle that we started with when we got to the point about how do we determine, how do we know what's halal and haram. So the first thing we start off with is that the asl, the original rule when it comes to non-religious things is al-hil. And if something is not permitted, Allah will tell us, His Messenger will tell us. And the reason being is because when you look at the Quran and even you look at the Sunnah, you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's Messenger are telling us that everything on this earth was created for us to use, to consume, and to take benefit from, to use for our advantage and our benefit. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُم مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا. He is the one who created for you everything in the earth, all that is in the earth, He created for you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning this in the context of what? Of a favor. And when Allah mentions something in the context of a favor, it means what? It means that He means it on a very broad and unrestricted scale. So, if somebody comes and says that something is haram, that's not religious, the burden of proof then becomes on them. Sometimes what happens is that a scholar is concerned about the name by which something is called and makes analogy between that animal of the sea with that name and the animal on land with that same name. So for example, catfish. Can you eat a catfish? Well, can you? You couldn't eat a cat. You guys see that? And you laugh, but seriously, right? Dogfish, or some other type of fish that has a name that resembles an animal on earth, on the land, which we can't eat. So that became something where some scholars err on the side of caution, but this erring on the side of caution was not really founded in the texts, or even in what we call usul al-fiqh, the fundamentals by which, or the principles by which we go and extract rulings. Also, if you look at the generality of the Quran and the Sunnah as it relates, for example, to marine animals. أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ صَيْدُ الْبَحْرِ. Lawful for you is what? The hunting of the sea. That's very general, anything in the sea. And the Prophet was even more emphatic about it. Some people came to him and they asked him about the water of the sea, because they were fishermen. They were seamen. And they wanted to know if they could make wudu. Was that water pure? And the Prophet was one of those people who, when he responded to a question, he wouldn't just answer the question, but answer questions that might come to a person's mind when they leave that city. So he said, huwa at-tahuru ma'u al-hillu maytatu. He said, the water of the sea is what? It's purified. You can use it to make wudu and wash yourself. And also, its dead things are what? Are lawful for you to eat. You could have a fish that's floating on the water, and you could do what? You could eat it. Now look what he said. Al-hillu maytatu. All of its dead things are what? Are lawful for you. You guys see that? So that means what? Anything in the sea. An octopus, an eel, whatever it is. But the only difference comes, or another issue that came with the whole marine animal thing is that, okay, what about an animal that lives some on the outside, some on the inside? Well, the scholars have an answer for that. They said that if an animal most of the time lives in the sea, then it will be judged an animal of the place where it lives most of the time. And if an animal lives most of the time outside of the sea, it will be judged by the place where it lives most of the time. The problem is, again, some scholars just what? Erring on the side of caution. And so that's where a lot of that comes from. But in cases like that, when we're trying to navigate, as just normal, people who don't have that level of knowledge to make ijtihad, we have these basic principles. The original rule is it's lawful. Everything is lawful, and everything on earth was meant for us what? To consume and take benefit of for our advantage. And so unless there's what? Clear proof, then we can what? We can consume it. But if there's some reason for us to what? To doubt. Legitimate reason to doubt. Then the Prophet gave us guidance. Da' ma yaribuk ila ma la yaribuk. Leave what makes you doubt for that which does not make you doubt. Something like shrimp, again, the fact that it's a scavenger or, catfish eat the trash, that has nothing to do with the ruling at all. But again, there may be animals which live most of their life outside of the sea. That's a reasonable discussion that scholars have given, and a person could say, you know what, I'm just going to leave that. So a lot of that comes from, again, maybe being overly cautious, reading into things, again, the naming of things and so on and so forth. A lot of that comes from that.
Outside of the marine things, the things like people hunt bear in squirrels. How do we find the rules?
Ahsan. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, everything that kills its prey with what? With a nab. It has that tooth that hangs down that what? It uses to what? To kill its prey, right? He also talked about birds of prey. Those birds that what? That kill other animals, right? Like hawks and eagles and so on and so forth. So he actually expressed that those birds are off limits, right? But there are other birds that don't do that, right? They don't do that, and they're what? They're in limits. So there is actual text to that effect. So that's what we base that on. Yeah. Anything else? Quickly, going once. Tafadali.
When it comes to khinzir, all the hadith of But he didn't mention like gelatin. So she said, what she found when it comes to the Quran and this part of them mentioned lahm.
Hey.
So she said, so gelatin. She said, so gelatin is halal because it's not wrong. It's not lahm.
This is why it's so important, in addition to the text, for us to look at the ijma'at, the consensus of the scholars. All the scholars, regardless of madhab, agree that the pig in its entirety is haram. The skin is haram. The bones are haram. The hair is najis. All of it's najis. And all of it's haram. And that's why it's important for a person not just to go to the Quran and say, oh, well, that's not how I see it. Because we have people who they're the authorities. And we want to make sure that whatever we're saying is in line with those people who they are the authorities indeed. And the scholars of Islam, regardless of madhab, consider the pig, min awwalihi ila akhirihi, najis. All of it. Anything comes from the pig is najis. طيب هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى اله وصحبه اجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمه الله وبركاته.